everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Debrief, the Atlantic Council Europe Center's internet show and podcast on some of the most pressing issues impacting the transatlantic relationship today. My name is Rizzo, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. And my guest today is Hans Kundnani, who is an associate fellow in the Europe program at Chatham House in London. He's also the author of a new book called Euro Whiteness, Culture, Empire, and Race in the European Project. And that's exactly what we are going to talk about today. Hans, thanks so much for taking time to join us.
Thank you so much for having me on, Rachel.
Absolutely. So I think this conversation is a really good follow-up to the Atlantic Debrief we did with John Henley from The Guardian a couple weeks ago, where we basically talked about the rise of the far right in Europe, the fact that it's happening not just in France or Italy, but sort of everywhere. It seems like the far right is sort of having a moment. And with you, I want to get sort of into this, but more into a conversation about like the European project and European identity and how your book sort of tries to unpack these things through a specific lens. And so I want to talk to you a little bit, like just dig into your book. Can you give us a sense of sort of the main argument that you make in it and what you're trying to unpack? It's pretty personal as well. I mean, this book that you wrote was sort of based on like personal experiences that you've had as a European, as someone who is like raised in the UK. So sort of just unpack this a little bit for us to get us started.
Yeah. Maybe I'll start with that. I mean, because this is actually how I start the book as well. You know, I am European, kinda, because, I was born and grew up in the UK, which obviously has this notoriously semi-detached relationship with Europe and with the European Union. But then on top of that, I have two parents who are immigrants to the UK. So my father was Indian, my mother is Dutch. So I have one parent who's from an EU member state, a founding EU member state, which I think in some ways probably made me feel more European than, say, a Brit who just has two parents from Britain. But then on the other hand, my father's Indian, in other words, from a country outside of Europe, a country that was colonized by Britain. And so, I always had this kind of sense of being sort of partially European, as it were, and that, as I say, together with, I think, my British upbringing means that, I think I have a slightly sort of peripheral perspective on Europe, and, you can make of that what you want. So the book really, I guess one way of thinking about it is that it's really, about sort of ideas of Europe through history and then, culminating in the European Union. And so I go all the way back to the medieval period when, European identity really first starts to emerge as a thing, as opposed to a space called Europe. And at that time, Europe was synonymous with Christendom, and being European was basically synonymous with Christianity. And then I look at the modern period where you have this much more complex idea of Europe that emerges, which, is partly to do with, the European Enlightenment and the scientific revolution and so on. So it's a kind of a rationalist and secular idea of Europe as opposed to a religious one. But it also emerges in the context of, the encounter of Europeans with the populations of Africa and Asia, and in particular the Americas. And that's also the context out of which the idea of whiteness emerges. And so, part of what the book does is to think about the relationship between Europe and whiteness, which, there obviously is a connection, but it's something that, certainly in the kind of European policy, foreign policy world is something that not many people talk about very, very much. And so, as I say, it looks at the evolution of those ideas of Europe and Europeanness in the modern period. And then really the question becomes, well, then this new idea of Europe that emerges after 1945 in the context of European integration, centered on what becomes the EU. What, if anything, does that have to do with these earlier, especially sort of ethnic cultural ideas of Europe that are connected to whiteness and to Christianity? And a lot of pro-Europeans would like to think it has nothing to do with them. There was a kind of a clean break, a sort of hour zero in 1945. But actually, if you look at the history, it's much, much messier than that. And actually, those kind of ethnic cultural ideas of Europe don't just disappear in 1945. They persist and they actually inform what becomes the European Union, and that's really what the book focuses on.
So basically, when it comes to European identity, I mean, you sort of talk about like European regionalism. And I think you unpacked this a little bit in your piece for The Guardian recently, yeah, where, this idea of being European seems to be okay, but European nationalism seems to be a problem, and how those two issues sort of interplay with and amongst each other, and what that means for the European project. Can you unpack that a little bit? I thought that was super interesting.
Yeah. So another way of thinking about what the book does is that it tries to sort of deconstruct some myths about the European Union. And for me, part of the process that led to me writing the book was this increasing sense that I had as I learned more about the European Union, the history of the European Union, that actually a lot of what I thought I knew about it actually was myth. And it was myth is a sort of self-mythologization of the EU. The EU is very good at creating these myths about itself. And one of those myths is the idea that the EU is a kind of an expression of cosmopolitanism, that it's a cosmopolitan project, which I always found quite puzzling, simply because, Europe is not the world. So, to circle back to, where I started around sort of questions around European identity, when you say I'm a European or I'm a European citizen, you're not saying I'm a citizen of the world. You're saying I'm a citizen of this very particular region called Europe, which, by the way, has this very, particular history and relationship with the rest of the world. And similarly, European integration is not global integration. As barriers to the movement of capital and goods and people have been removed within Europe, they haven't necessarily, particularly in relation to people, haven't been removed in relation to the rest of the world. In fact, it's kind of the flip side of, say, freedom of movement is a hard external border, as I think the EU has discovered increasingly since the refugee crisis in 2015. So those are all illustrations simply of the way that, Europe is not the world, but there is, this tendency, which I call the sort of Eurocentric fallacy among pro-Europeans, to sort of mistake Europe for the world, to think that when they do something in the interest of Europeans, it's sort of somehow in the interest of the whole world. And I don't think that's the case. So, I begin by trying to sort of challenge, this one particular myth about the EU, which is the idea of a cosmopolitan Europe. And then I say, well, look, I think a better way to think about European identity and the EU is as something which I call regionalism, which is actually very analogous to nationalism. It's just that it's on a larger continental scale. And part of the reason I think that's so helpful to think of it in that way is that it then means that there's all kinds of resources that we have from the study of nationalism that we can then apply to Europe as to European regionalism. And one of those, which is the one which I really focus on, is this distinction between a sort of ethnic cultural nationalism on the one hand and a civic nationalism on the other hand. And I suggest that we should, as they apply that to European regionalism. And so then what I try to do in the book is trace the very complex interaction through the history of Europe and, ideas of Europe going all the way back to the medieval period, as I mentioned, but then through to the present day, this kind of complex interaction between these ethnic cultural ideas of Europe and civic ideas of Europe. And, my argument essentially is that they're very, there's been a long history of this kind of interaction, and the ethnic cultural ideas, as I say, didn't simply disappear and play no role in the European Union. They're still there. And so, but thinking of it in terms of regionalism allows you, I think, to see with greater clarity those different elements in European regionalism.
Well, and it seems like the far right throughout Europe is sort of grabbing a hold of these like ethnic cultural differences and using them to, define what it means to be European. It seems as though when you look at someone like Meloni or Marine Le Pen in France, there's this idea that I'm not really sure how to explain it. Like, it seems as though these aren't just they're not just movements that are taking place in Italy or France or these pockets of Europe, but rather they're trying to make this sort of like ethnic cultural issue one of what it means to be European, not just what it means to be Italian or French, but like a whole protection of Europeanism and the European project. And I don't know if that's right, but that's sort of what I'm gathering from following these like far right movements throughout Europe.
No, I think that's exactly right, and this is exactly what I try to discuss in the book. So my argument then is that I think because obviously we've known for the last decade, right, about we've all been focusing on the rise of the far right in Europe. This is not new in a way. I mean, they've been gradually getting more and more powerful. There's been ups and downs, but you can see that the long-term trajectory is upwards. France, I guess, being sort of paradigmatic, but also very, very important case, right? But I think that my argument is that we've thought about this in a very binary way. That it's the far right against the EU, because the far right are nationalists, right? And so how can they, cooperate amongst each other? I mean, by the way, they do cooperate very well. There's this transnational network of the far right. So just in, empirical terms, they're very good actually at cooperating with each other. But also conceptually, my argument is that it's a simplification to think of them as being purely nationalists who speak on behalf of the nation against Europe and against the EU. Actually, if you look at the the far right, and there's a lot of very good academic research on this, and I'm on this as on some other aspects of the book. A big part of what I'm doing is really just translating some of the academic research that has been done by other people. There's a lot of research on this. There's a kind of a tension that exists in the far right between, on the one hand, nationalism, and it's not completely untrue that they're nationalists. That's part of their thinking. But there's also this second element, which is the bit that tends to be discussed less, which is civilizationalism. So they're also speaking on behalf of European civilization, and in particular, this idea of a threatened European civilization. I saw yesterday that Eric Zemmour was speaking at a rally in France, and on the podium that he was speaking at, the slogan was "Defend our civilization."
Yeah,
that's a perfect example of this. Now, so the far right, I think we've rather simplistically thought of as being just nationalists, rather than also seeing they have, in a sense, this kind of pro-Europeanism of their own too. But then the flip side of that is, I think we've also slightly overlooked the way that it's not just the far right that is speaking in these civilizational terms, but that increasingly more centrist parties, particularly the centre right, have also been using this civilizational kind of language. And so you get a kind of a convergence between the far right and the centre right, to the point at which I think it becomes very difficult actually just to distinguish between them.
Yeah, I mean, and you sort of talk about this a little bit where, if the far right is no longer marked not solely, but marked primarily by Euroscepticism. In fact, they are in many ways pro-EU, but they want to change it in the way that they think is right for Europe. And at the same time, it seems as though the center right has converged with the far right on some issues, mainly, as you say, identity, Islam, and immigration. And what that has created is, sort of an indistinguishable block between the center right and far right. What does that mean for the EU? I mean, we have European elections coming up in 2024. Where is this going?
Yeah. So I think that what this means is we need to start thinking about something which, until quite recently, would have seemed to many people to be sort of not just impossible, but kind of a contradiction in terms, which is the possibility of a far-right EU. Because traditionally, the EU has been run by, a sort of grand coalition, essentially, of the centre-right and the centre-left against the extremes. But that may now be changing. We'll see what happens next year in the European elections, but I think we have to start to think about whether that may be changing, and that this convergence between the centre-right and the far-right might start to produce a different kind of EU. And as you said, I think one of the big debates, when we talk about the far right, is the extent to which they're becoming more moderate. and different people see it in different ways. And obviously it gets quite complicated because obviously you have different far-right parties in different European countries, and they're all a little bit different from each other. They all have different ideologies. They don't all agree on everything. And so it's a very complicated kind of picture. And if you take, say, an example like the AfD in Germany, which is, is getting more radical, not getting more moderate. It's quite extraordinary. It's managing to do better and better in the polls while becoming more radical. But as I say, that's a little bit of an outlier. I think the overall trend is that, particularly if you think about, Marine Le Pen in France, but also Giorgia Meloni, who's now an Italian prime minister, there's been this big debate about, are they becoming more moderate? And some people, particularly people on the centre-right, want to believe that they are, and they're sort of becoming maybe a little bit harmless. I don't think that's right. I think that they're becoming more moderate in a very selective way. And in particular, they're moderating around, I think, two things. Meloni is a really good example of this. They're moderating around two things. One is their Euroscepticism. So one of the big fears when Meloni became Italian prime minister was, would she disrupt the Eurozone? As, by the way, even some of her more moderate, centre-left, centre-right predecessors, they've been quite aggressive on questions to do with the Eurozone, for example, in that, the first few years of the Euro crisis, or if you think about Matteo Renzi. So that was the first issue. The second is the war in Ukraine and Russia. One of the big fears about Meloni was that, she would be a bit pro-Russian and not supportive enough of Ukraine. Now, she very quickly indicated that she wouldn't be too disruptive on the Eurozone, and she would be quite supportive of Ukraine. And my sense is, and this is one of the things I found very striking about that moment, was a lot of pro-Europeans then ceased to have a problem with her. As long as she wasn't difficult on those two issues, they were almost, I want to say, prepared to turn a blind eye to her, very aggressive rhetoric and policies on these questions around, as you mentioned, identity, immigration, and Islam. Not least because, as I say, the centre-right has been moving in that direction anyway, especially since the refugee crisis in 2015. That, I think, in retrospect, will turn out to have been the critical juncture. And so I think if this far-right EU that I'm talking about, I mean, when I say far-right, I really mean one based on this kind of convergence between the centre-right and the far-right. In some ways, it won't be that different from the current EU, but it will have a much harder line, as the EU has increasingly already been having, on these questions around identity and immigration and Islam. So it's a kind of a fortress Europe idea, basically.
Does this sort of assume that young Europeans are becoming more right wing? Because it seems as though when you talk to young people, especially in Europe, they're much more interested in human security, climate, protecting the environment, making sure that, nuclear weapons, there are multilateral nuclear weapon treaties. I don't know if that's just a European thing, because in the US we have that too, but young college age white men have been pretty taken by Trumpist rhetoric here. So a lot of young, I want to lump it in and say just young people, but particularly young men. This is messaging that they gravitate toward. I don't know if you have an opinion on this from a European side, but I'd be interested.
I would love to think that young people in Europe are more progressive than previous generations, but I'm afraid it's not true. Again, this is where it gets quite complicated because there's a different picture in different countries. But let's again return to France. Young people vote for Le Pen much more than older people do. So it's a little bit different from I think a lot of the way that we think about the far right, or to use the term that's mostly used, populism, has been through this prism of Brexit and Trump, right? And there was this clear trend where older people tended to vote for Brexit and Trump more than younger people, although, as you say, that's changing. But in some European countries, it's different. And as I say, in some cases, it's even the opposite of that. And France is a good example of that. And then one additional thing on the gender question, because again, I think this is this is, and I should add here, I'm not, I'm not an academic researching the far right. There are other people who know this, much more detail than I do. But it's quite interesting how some of the gender dynamics, I mean, again, they're quite complicated, but they're changing a little bit too. And it's very striking that, again, to come back to the two examples we've been talking a little bit about, Italy and France, you have female leaders of the far right. And, that I think also is having, there's a bigger picture there in terms of voting patterns as well. It has, I think, been the case that men have, traditionally voted for far right parties more than women. But again, that may now be changing.
So final question, and as you said, I know you're not an academic that's researching the far right or, European political parties per se, but what does this mean for the European left? I mean, your entire book, looking at Euro whiteness and culture, what does it mean for the left movement? We talk a lot about the right, but let's talk about the left first.
It's a great question, and this is the question I ask myself because I'm approaching this from a left perspective too. I think what it means is the left increasingly has a dilemma where, and I think this dilemma has existed to some extent already, but I think it's becoming more acute, which is, I think, the left is increasingly going to be forced to choose between its pro-Europeanism and its left-wing principles. As I say, I think you've seen that already on, say, economic questions to do with the euro, where centre-left parties in Europe, take the German Social Democrats, I think have kind of compromised on, the idea of a left-wing economic policy in the name of, their support for the European Union. So if you, look, as I say, in those debates, during the euro crisis and the way that the SPD, was quite supportive of, the EU's fiscal rules and so on. I mean, the debt brake was actually a creation of the German Social Democrat Party, right? During the Merkel government. And so I think there's been these moments before where the centre left has, there's been a little bit of a tension between, some left-wing ideas and pro-Europeanism. But I think now with this increasing convergence between the centre right and the far right around these questions of identity and immigration and Islam, I think that choice is going to become even more acute for the centre left in Europe, especially after the European Parliament elections next year.
All right. Thank you. This was super fascinating. I know that we could continue this conversation for a full hour or longer, but we don't have that kind of time. So with that, I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us and talk about your new book. And hopefully we can continue the conversation maybe sometime next year after the European elections. We can see what happens.
Yeah, great. Thank you again for having me on.
Absolutely. Thanks, Hans.